All right, so we will now be starting with our program. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues. Oh, okay. We're just waiting for a few more colleagues to join us in the room. Hey, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, colleagues, and partners, good morning, and thank you very much for making the time to join us. My name is Kesao Bakanin Simo Pipi, Kesa for short and for shortness and ease. It's a pleasure to be here with you in Addis, particularly as we reconvene almost exactly a year after our last engagement we had here in Addis Ababa, which was a G20 dialogue session with the African diplomatic community. I think the continuity of this work really speaks to the importance and the relevance or value that it really creates. And, this engagement is not just a reflection. I think we need to view it as a transition point. We have had a year of intense engagement across the G20 and across other related global processes. And those efforts have culminated in some outcomes. And really, I think the purpose of our session here today is to mark the beginning of where the real work begins in terms of pushing those outcomes forward. I will not take too much of your time, just to appreciate the office of the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, the Embassy of the Union of the Comoros, who have been greatly instrumental in assisting us with putting together these engagements. Unfortunately, the Dean could not be with us here today, but we just wanted to say a word of appreciation for the assistance they've continued to give us in organizing these engagements. Without further ado, I think we can get started with our program since we are cognizant of time as well. I will call to the front Miss Elizabeth Sideropoulos from the South African Institute of International Affairs to come and just give us her opening remarks or welcoming remarks. Elizabeth?
Yeah, that's fine. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Kesa. It's good to be back in Addis a year after we, as Kesa said, had a really good engagement, particularly with African member states related to G20 issues. The title of today's event is really sustaining Africa's G20 agenda across global processes. So last year was the first time that an African country chaired the G20. We know the G20 is an informal club where the idea behind it was for systemically important countries and regions to work together to achieve consensus on issues that could then be taken forward in other formal multilateral processes. Clearly, the G20 has gone through its ups and downs. It's been very good in responding to crises. It's been less good, perhaps, when things are progressing relatively or reasonably well. And so certainly many will agree, and that came out also of the review that South Africa conducted last year of the G20, that the high points were the 2008 financial crisis, and indeed some of the responses surrounding the COVID pandemic in 2020. But last year, which was the first year, as I said, that South Africa, that an African state chaired the G20, was when I think a number of really critical issues for the African agenda were put onto the G20 agenda. And as with all presidencies, there's only so much one can achieve in a single year of a G20 presidency. But what you do thereafter is, I think, what is really, really critical. During the course of this morning, we'll be discussing a number of the outcomes of the South African G20 presidency and how these can be driven not just through the G20, whether it's this year or next year under the British presidency, but certainly how they can be driven in other relevant multilateral fora. And of course, critically, how the African Union itself can play a really critical role working together with South Africa as both G20 members, but also with other, importantly, with other member states, and creating coalitions outside of Africa to drive some of these agenda items forward, whether we're talking about climate change or disaster risk or inequality or illicit financial flows and so on. So this is this roundtable is really an opportunity to just reflect a little bit on what transpired last year, the outcomes, to also engender a conversation around these points, and then see how these are already being rolled out in different fora, but very importantly, how we can build up a momentum as Africans to actually drive change in global processes. At a time, I have to add, at a time where we all know that international cooperation is under severe strain, and that the geopolitical tensions that's probably a mild word to use in the context, but the geopolitical tensions make international cooperation even more difficult. That doesn't mean we should step back, but that we should in fact redouble our efforts in driving our agenda forward and in fostering and building coalitions and collaboration and partnerships with like-minded regions and like-minded countries. I'll stop there. I look forward to the conversations today, and you'll hear a little bit more from me a little later.
Just give her a round of applause, please. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for those remarks, particularly on stressing the importance of really pulling up our socks in terms of international cooperation, particularly in the current geopolitical context that we find ourselves in. At this time, I would also like to call upon Prof. Bartholomew Kingsley Ama from Audanepid to also give his welcoming remarks.
Yeah, thank you, and Excellencies, distinguished guests. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you to share experiences and I guess help strategize on how we move forward following the South African's presidency last year. I think a lot has happened since then. I had the distinct honor of being part of the process last year, and it helped shape my thinking on the development process, how we shift from theory, policy, and to action. I think really the focus here should be on how we position ourselves to respond practically and pragmatically to the shifting geopolitics, the difficult political environment that we find ourselves in, but how we also leverage our own resources and acumen to navigate these difficult times. We know that under South Africa's presidency, we moved from being talked about to being listened to, in the sense that we're able to shape the agenda. But we also know that the G20 really came to its fore during a period of crisis, and we're right now entering into one. And this is another test of how the G20 can respond to that crisis. But now that we're part of that process, the question then is, how do we play an effective role in that response mechanism, taking into account the fact that we are also very vulnerable to these crises. From the outer NEPAD perspective, our mandate is implementation. And we know that that's really where the rubber touches the road. So the limelight is going to be shining on us. We try to translate declarations into development plans, turn global commitments into local realities. So the question then is, what must we lock in so that Africa's agenda does not reset with every G20 presidency? Because much as we gained momentum last year, the challenge is, how do we sustain that momentum, and how do we leverage our capabilities and resources into actually getting our interests realized. The new AU G20 Continental Steering Committee mechanism is one mechanism that can help institutionalize our response to these challenges. Outer NEPAD stands ready to serve as its technical backbone, ensuring commitments are tracked, coordinated, and delivered. And I think one of the areas where I think the G20 perhaps could evolve and really work in our favor is really going beyond the commitments to tracking and ensuring that these commitments actually are implemented. And so that's an area that we're willing to support. Of course, and in this environment of political tensions, we risk being marginalized if we do not assert ourselves as developing countries. Our priorities risk becoming footnotes while the world focuses on strategic competition, or worse, fragmentation. Because there's a threat that different countries will be pulled into competing blocs, weakening the collective voice that we fought so hard to build. And we all know that speaking with one voice is critical from an African point of view, because as small fragmented countries, our effectiveness and our impact is diminished. This is why institutionalization matters. Frameworks like the African Engagement Framework are anchors. They give us predictability when geopolitics gives us turbulence. They tell the world that Africa's development is not a side issue, it is foundational to global stability. The Ubuntu Commission also speaks to this directly. Ubuntu, which you all know means I am because we are, is a challenge to the zero-sum logic gripping global affairs. No nation, no matter how powerful, can insulate itself from debt distress in Africa or climate vulnerability in the Sahel. The Commission is our opportunity to reclaim the narrative of interdependence. So let me leave you with this. We have proven we can set the agenda. The question now is whether we can sustain it. We have the frameworks. We have the steering mechanisms. We have the agency. What we need now is the discipline to lock in what we have gained and the resolve to protect our space in a fracturing world. Outer NEPAD that I represent so far in this context is ready to deliver. Let us leave this room with reflections, not with reflections, but with an implementation roadmap. I thank you for your
Thank you very much, Prof. Butt, for those insightful remarks. I think you have also made my job slightly easier in terms of the next agenda item by really highlighting some of those practical or implementable outcomes that came out of the G20 and really bringing forth a call to sustain the momentum and ensuring the realization of those outcomes. So I'm really looking forward to what will be a fruitful discussion with everybody here in the room for us to actually see ourselves as not just passive actors, but implementers or partners in implementing those outcomes as well. I will be speaking or reflecting on some of the key outcomes of South Africa's G20 presidency, as well as looking at the US's G20 priorities. Now, of course, we know that South Africa's agenda was pretty broad, expensive, and ambitious, placed South Africa and African priorities, particularly Agenda 2063, at the center of the discussions at the G20. And some of the issues had successful outcomes, which were either legacy initiatives or, achieved consensus on some issues. Of course, there were other issues that were not as maybe successful in that sense. But what I really want to spotlight here are the key outcomes and legacy initiatives, which as the stakeholders currently in the room should be looking at in terms of driving forward, either from a continent, either as continental initiatives or in other forums such as the UN. So, as earlier mentioned, the agenda really focused on issues that are very important, not just to South Africa, but for the continent. For instance, on inequality, there was an inequality panel which consolidated the body of work on inequality to really deliver some targeted recommendations, including the establishment of a permanent international panel on inequality. We will be hearing a bit more about the outcomes of the inequality report, as well as the progress thus far from one of the panel members that was in the panel last year. Another important priority for South Africa was around debt sustainability. And in this regard, the G20 presidency established the Africa Expert Panel, which produced a report on growth, debt, and development. That panel is still active in terms of promoting the work of the report, as well as ensuring that those recommendations find manifestation in the form of initiatives across the continent. Another issue that was advocated for was a fair climate finance architecture, including, for instance, the launch of a G20 Clean Cooking Legacy Program and the Africa Energy Efficiency Facility. We will be hearing more about the climate and sustainable finance agenda shortly from one of our online panelists. Another area where solutions were advanced is in how Africa manages its abundant mineral resources, particularly the critical minerals framework, which really placed green industrialization and local beneficiation as an essential component of critical minerals governance. And I think this is of particular importance, not just in the context of the just energy transition, for example, but also in the conversation or the evolving conversation on AI solutions, which we know, of course, require quite a lot of investment on physical infrastructure that requires those critical minerals, and is of interest to a broader list of stakeholders across the globe in that sense. And just on the issue of AI as well, there was a launch of an AI for Africa initiative, which was launched in conjunction with the AU and UNESCO. And really the aim of that initiative is to train civil servants and judicial personnel in artificial intelligence, along with a Pan-African incubator for researchers. So really the aim here is to build capacity on the continent around AI. And I think that's an initiative that's will be interesting to follow in terms of how it progresses moving forward. Some other outcomes, which we will also be hearing more about later throughout our program, was a call to action on illicit financial flows. We will be hearing a presentation on that agenda item and how it was placed on the agenda and how it evolved as well as hearing from Elizabeth again on the Ubuntu Commission on Global Public Goods, which Prof. Butt also already touched a little bit on. But in terms of the initiatives that really speak to the heart of Africa's agenda, I thought it was worth highlighting the G20 Africa Cooperation Agenda, which was launched in the joint stream by the South African G20 presidency. And really, it's supposed to be a consolidated framework for a partnership between Africa and the G20. There was also a launch of the second phase of the G20 Compact with Africa, which is very instrumental in terms of informing infrastructure initiatives on the continent moving forward. This alongside an Ubuntu Legacy initiative to accelerate cross-border infrastructure projects by fostering collaboration among African stakeholders and development partners. Last but not least, I will mention the Africa Engagement Framework, which also kind of goes hand in hand with the work of the Africa Expert Panel, which supports that in a way. And I think it speaks to also Prof. Butt's point around the institutionalization of some of these agenda items in creating the predictability. And I think an example of that is this Africa Engagement Framework, which is really the basis for how Africa will be engaging in the finance track on key priority items. And I think it is important to also follow that as well as engage with that framework and see how we can promote the work both within the G20 and outside. And just to echo maybe a bit of the welcoming remarks that we have heard here today, I think what is important here is not really the outcomes themselves, but the structures that we create to sustain those outcomes. I think these are not to be viewed really as endpoints, but as entry points for continued influence. So now I'll also just shift a bit to the priorities under the US presidency, which is more, the approach here has been more streamlined and more focused, which is also driven by a view that the G20 must return to its core economic mandate. The US agenda is centered mostly on three main thematic areas, which is essentially economic growth through deregulation, energy security and affordability, innovation, particularly in AI and emerging technologies. And these core priorities or thematic areas will be operationalized through working groups, 4 core working groups, one on trade, one on growth and deregulation, one on innovation, and one on energy abundance. Of course, having said everything that I've said about the outcomes of the South African G20 presidency, as well as the thematic areas of the US presidency, I think we can already see that there's a clear dynamic here, where in one instance you had an expanded and sort of deepened agenda, and now you have a more narrow or refocused agenda. And I think as mentioned by previous speakers or the previous speaker as well, there is a risk here that within this current context that African priorities can become diluted or overshadowed. But on the other side, I think there is an opportunity that many of these issues, particularly that relate to energy, trade, innovation, those issues are not necessarily disconnected from Africa's agenda. And so I think what is important here is that there is intentional positioning, particularly on the side of the African Union, given that as we are aware, South Africa is not directly engaging this year. So I think it's important to be very intentional and very strategic about how the priorities and the outcomes of South Africa's G20 presidency are reflected in the AU's agenda moving forward. As stakeholders that are currently in the room, I want to implore us to really not see ourselves not only as participants in this process, but to view ourselves as champions of ensuring that Africa's agenda continues to move forward. And to this end, I would like to leave us with a challenge as we continue to proceed in the discussions today. I think let us be intentional in asking the following questions. What within our respective roles and within our institutions is actionable now? Where can we actively carry forward these priorities, whether it's within the G20 or across other platforms or on the continent itself? And how do we ensure that the momentum that was built under South Africa's presidency is not lost, but is translated into sustained influence? Because I echo the sentiment that the value of this convening is not really the richness of the discussion alone, but in whether we leave this room with a clearer sense of a mandate of action. And with that, I think I will call on our next speaker to offer reflections on the outcomes of South Africa's G20 Just Energy Transition and Sustainable Finance Agenda. Do we have Alex online?
Yes, can I just confirm that you can hear me in the room? Are you getting me on audio?
Okay, Alex, over to you.
Can you confirm that you are getting me on audio?
Nancy, can you hear Alex? Is what he's asking.
While he's still
No,
getting
he
ready,
can hear you.
Alex is the head of our climate and natural resources program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and him and his team engaged quite a lot in terms of supporting South Africa's G20 presidency, particularly in terms of the climate, energy and sustainable finance agenda. So I know that we're definitely going to derive a lot of value from his presentation.
Nancy, can you hear me? Can you hear me on that side?
Okay.
Is there anyone who is logged in virtually who can communicate
Yes,
with the room?
Alex,
I think
can hear you.
we're unable to
I've
hear
just
him,
sent
but
a
he might be
message.
audible online.
They might need to switch to the next speaker or whoever's in the room while we sort out why the online speakers can't be heard in the room.
Okay, I will check with the IT guy now, and I will message them on the group.
Testing, testing. They need to move on. Is there anyone who can communicate with the room?
I'm on it on my side with the WhatsApp.
I can hear him online, but we can't hear him chat.
Hello, can you hear me?
Um, sorry for that.
Testing, can you hear me?
Sheikh, can you hear us online? Are you able to unmute?
I am unmuted. Can you hear me? But I think it would be the same issue as Alex. I can hear him.
Oh
I
no,
can hear you online.
yeah, we can hear you in the room as well. We might just need to increase the volume a bit. Um, if you are able to kindly indulge us, I know your session is supposed to come after our discussion, but maybe as we are fixing up some of those technical issues, let me just properly introduce you first. So this session is so our next speaker is Sheikh Zian from the African Development Bank. He will be speaking about the Africa Engagement Framework and really focusing on the content and structure as well as the work of the AFDB in terms of supporting the work of the Africa Engagement Framework as well. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Keza. Can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Loud and clear. Thank you.
Perfect. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me to be here with you today. My name is Sheikh Jain. I'm advisor to the Vice President of Finance and CFO of the African Development Bank, and I had the honor of being part of the G20 process over the last 4 years, first representing the African Union as G20 deputy, and recently as representing the African Development Bank in the International Financial Architecture Working Group. In this particular past G20 presidency, really focus on the Africa Engagement Forward framework and then other topics pertaining to Africa's international reform agenda. So I first want to acknowledge the South African Institute of International Affairs for the opportunity to speak and congratulate the work that SAIIA has done on this particular topic. So let me just jump right in. What is the Africa Engagement Framework? So South Africa, when they assumed the G20 presidency, they operated under the theme solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And from the outset, it was clear that it was going to be an African G20 presidency. And to make that intent concrete, they established a study examining the key factors that were impeding Africa's growth and development. 4 international organizations led the analytical work: the IMF on macroeconomic vulnerabilities, the World Bank on institutional weaknesses, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank on infrastructure development, and our bank, the African Development Bank, on the high cost of capital. Those 4 impediments constituted one analytical backbone of South Africa's G20 agenda. The other analytical backbone, which was actually mentioned by Keza, is the Africa Expert Panel, which was chaired by former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel. And they produced a report and, in their own word, call for a paradigm shift away from aid dependence and toward a model of productive investment anchored in African agency and global partnership. The recognition through South Africa's presidency was that the analytical work was sound, the political momentum was real, the magnitude of change required was far greater than could be delivered in a single presidency. So therefore, we designed a framework to outlast its own tenure, the G20 Finance Track Africa Engagement Framework. And let me start by saying that based on the different types of working groups, the African Engagement Framework is actually not a new framework. It's basically putting together the different topics across the different working groups, whether it is the International Financial Architecture Working Group, the Sustainable Finance, the Infrastructure, and putting them together as one particular framework that cuts across the entire G20 finance track. It's organized in 5 policy pillars. The first pillar is on fiscal and macroeconomic challenges, addressing the structural fiscal vulnerabilities that constrain African governments' capacity to invest, covers prudent fiscal policy, domestic resource mobilization, debt sustainability and transparency, monetary and financial stability frameworks. The second pillar is on institutional areas for enhancing governance. This covers public financial management, debt management offices, tax policy and administration, transparency, data, and regulatory predictability. The third pillar is on the development and enhancement of domestic and regional infrastructure. This work is being led by the AIIB. Infrastructure is the backbone of the economy. Between 130 to 170 billion dollars in annual infrastructure deficit, and it requires Africa to invest at least 7% of its GDP annually to close the infrastructure gap. So this is the context in which this work, together with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and Agenda 2063, anchors infrastructure investment as a core pillar for sustaining Africa's sustainable development going forward. Pillar number 4 is on reducing the high cost of internal and external capital. This is a work particularly that the African Development Bank is doing, addressing macro credibility on domestic financial systems, credit market development, risk-sharing tools such as guarantees and political risk insurance, data quality, sovereign credit ratings, and Africa's representation and participation in global standard setting. And the last but not least, the fifth pillar is the role of international financial institutions. It addresses the adequacy of concessional resources, MDB balance sheet leveraging, private finance mobilization at scale through de-risking platforms, crisis response tools, and more predictable and timely sovereign debt workouts. So, 4 organizations driving this, the IMF, the World Bank, the AIIB, and the African Development Bank, each carrying ongoing responsibility for the Pillar Day at NALAS. African Development Bank role is particularly central. It is developing the creditworthiness and sovereign transparency platform to help African finance ministries engage more effectively with credit rating agencies, conceptualizing the Africa Risk Mitigation Agency as a one-stop instrument for guarantees, political risk insurance, and refinancing tools, and its annual meetings provide one of the key pressure points in the multilateral calendar for advancing some of these topics, including the high cost of capital. So today, the African Union, as Keza mentioned, the G20 has been more streamlined under the US presidency. So therefore, to sustain this momentum, the African Union carries that political stewardship role. Its STCs, the Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning, and Integration, is the formal ministerial body through which African finance ministers and central bank governors can coordinate policy positions across the continent. It is the right instrument through which African positions should be aligned before each major multilateral engagement. South Africa National Treasury has held the founding stewardship of the AEF, and because of the current context today, it is important that we continue to double down on our engagement through the African Union. I just want to touch upon very quickly on the high cost of capital today. Sovereign bonds today have been issued at yields consistently 200 to 300 basis points above comparable emerging market peers. So BB rated sovereigns have borrowed at rates more than 100 basis points higher than similarly rated peers in other regions. This is not sustainable. Yet, the sub-Saharan African sovereign default rates have not significantly exceeded those of similarly rated emerging markets. The premium is not fully explained by the actual risk, partially explained by perception. And this is work that the Africa Expert Panel named directly. While returns on investments in Africa often exceeded those in developed countries, investors are deterred by regulatory barriers and distorted perceptions of risk. Correcting those perceptions require action on 3 fronts: on credit agency reform, number 2, on global banking regulation reform, and number 3, on risk-sharing tools to put them at scale. So going forward, as the agenda moves to the global north, first with the US G20 presidency, following by the UK, and then to Korea, let me propose some actionable steps. The single most important discipline is pre-alignment. Before every major multilateral meeting, whether it be the IMF World Bank spring meetings in April, the AFDB annual meetings in May, the Africa Forward Summit in Nairobi, the G7 Summit in June by President Macron, African institutions need an agreed common position. It should convene substantive technical working sessions 4 to 6 weeks before each major meeting with a specific mandate. agreed of African position on IEF priority issues, assigned lead spokespersons by topic, and briefed the incoming G20 presidency formally on African asks before they finalize their own agenda. So we need to commit to annual consultations between the AU and incoming G20 presidencies, and we should have a dedicated annual G20 Africa policy retreat convened by the AU Commission in the first quarter of each year before the G20 finance track enters its peak season. This retreat should bring together AU STC members, South Africa as a founding steward of the AEF, the African Development Bank and other international African institutions, the Africa Expert Panel in its continuing advisory capacity, and finance ministers who are going to be observers. And the agenda should answer 3 questions. What did the previous G20 presidency deliver on AEF pillars? What does the incoming presidency's theme and priorities offer as entry points for African issues? And 3, what are the 2 or 3 priority asks that Africa will advance consistently across the multilateral calendar this year? The output should be a concise African G20 priorities paper transmitted formally to the incoming G20 presidency by the AU chairperson who represents the African Union at those meetings. And that paper then becomes the reference document for every African delegation, every multilateral meeting for the rest of that year. So we need to use the platform in the multilateral calendar. We need to be very coordinated. We need to have pre-alignment meetings and deliver these messages in a consistent manner. And finally, we need to build a broader coalition. This was a lesson from our Dakar meeting that its AIIA had organized together with Africatalyst, Other NetPad, and UNDP. And there were some severe concrete proposals that were mentioned and that deserve to be carried forward. A continental G20 coordination mechanisms, the participation of, let's say, organizations such as the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions as invited organizations in the G20, and the recommendations of establishing a G20 African Policy Knowledge Hub. Because as you know, some of the G20 members, they have a dedicated team that do only G7, G20 year round. We need to build a deep benchmark of policy people, the highest level of policy making for the African continent who can have institutional memory of these issues, understand them, understand the context, and deliver these messages in a consistent manner. So the AEF is a very serious piece of institutional architecture. The 5 substantive pillars, the analytical backing of 4 major international organizations, and the political endorsement of G20 FMCBG members, and a roadmap that runs to 2030. The Africa Expert Panel has given us an independent analytical foundation that the leaders have accepted. There's a stronger starting position than any previous African G20 engagement has enjoyed. So we all have a role to play. Let us continue to play that role. Let us be consistent in our messaging. Let us have pre-alignment meetings, and let us build a deep bench of policymakers that will drive Africa's agenda going forward. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think I will be echoing everybody's sentiments here when I say that it was very informative, and I think it had really concrete recommendations and discussion points that we can carry forward and also speak to here. I will not try to summarize everything, but I think at this moment, let me just give Prof. Bart to just come in and also speak on this item and respond.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the speaker who laid out all the issues. There's not much to disagree with. Just to perhaps, add to what has been said. I think few would disagree with the fact that the AEF is an important element in our engagement in this G20. I think the first issue we need to grapple with is, it is a framework but it's not a binding framework on the different presidencies to adopt, right? Each presidency can choose what it wants to focus on. So the first challenge, though, is how do we ensure that the framework actually becomes part of the agenda of subsequent presidencies? So there's a lot of groundwork and political networking that we need to do to achieve the objectives. The second thing we need to look at is the geopolitical context is evolving, right? And how does that make our work easier or more difficult in achieving the objectives? So, for example, if we take the cost of capital, with these tensions, there's a tendency that inflation is going to go up, interest rates are going to rise. How does that affect the investment flows and where they go? Because right now there's also a primacy of investing in defense, right? Because the priorities are also changing. And as these priorities change, how do they align with our own priorities? So the third thing that then follows from that is we need to have a backup plan, right? It's not, what if the investment flows do not go in our direction? But in most cases, there are winners and losers even within the continent, right? The just transition agenda could be halted or attenuated because of the need for fossil fuels currently, or it could also lead to an increased demand for green energy. But the thing is that the countries that are producing fossil fuels in Africa could be benefiting from these higher crude oil prices. And so is this also an opportunity for us to push the LPG agenda, the liquefied natural gas? Because we need to then see where these risks and opportunities lie and how we can position ourselves to benefit. On the cost of capital, the AU, as you're all aware, has been working on the Africa Credit Rating Agency as a mechanism to improve our credit ratings. Of course, you don't do that by legislation. It's all about credibility and addressing what the factors that are leading to that Africa risk premium that was just described above by our previous speaker. And one of the factors that leads to this risk premium has been a lack of information about what's really going on in our finances. To the extent that that is true, I think we need to work that into how the Africa Credit Rating Agency addresses these issues. One is to address these information asymmetries. And here, perhaps there's an opportunity to leverage technology. You're probably all aware of blockchain technology, which basically digitizes information in a way that is transparent and democratically accessible by everybody. So what if our transactions, revenue and expenditure transactions, were tokenized, meaning that put in a digitally available and accessible to the world, right? That helps to address the information asymmetries and project some transparencies into our transactions, and then could address all these information asymmetries which we are paying for in the form of a higher risk premium. The second is to address some of the methodological gaps in the credit rating system. So, for example, when a country is hit by floods, it affects its balance sheet. Countries then get downgraded because they will not have the resources to pay their debts, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, Africa has an abundance of natural assets, right? The Congo Basin is the second lung of the planet, second to the Brazilian what is it called? The Amazon, right? However, that asset is not factored in as an economic asset when we're being assessed. So on the one hand, when we get hit by an environmental shock, we're penalized, but we're not rewarded for actually minimizing some of these environmental shocks. So the concrete ask here is, how do we ensure that these factors that are become factored into the methodology that assess our financial credit worthiness? And that is a task that I think the Africa Credit Rating Agency could work on. Now, in terms of investments, I think that building on the term charity begins at home, we also need to use our own resources for investments. And I think the question would be, the obvious question, do we have those resources? If we do, why are we going to outside? Well, if you look at the recent report by the African Finance Corporation, it says that pension funds and insurance companies in Africa are sitting on about $777 billion in assets, right? These assets are largely invested in very low risk, safe investments. Right? Infrastructure does not factor much in terms of the use of our own resources for investments. However, we look outside externally for external investors to invest in our economies. So the question then is, how do we incentivize or change the incentive structure of our own domestic investors, the pension funds and the insurance, to invest in our own economies? Now, recently, Outer NEPAD, in collaboration with the African Association of Multilateral Financial Institutions, these are 15 banks that came together to collectively finance some of the priority areas of the Agenda 2063. This was the first time where African banks have come together to make those kinds of investments. But it's a model that can be followed, can be built on. So the point here is, through collective investments of our own domestic resources, we could catalyze external investments, because by investing in our own economies, we in effect de-risk external investors. And secondly, by putting in place and changing the policy frameworks that inhibit our own pension funds and insurance companies from investing in risky assets and in domestic investments, we could also catalyze additional external resources. And then thirdly, by employing blockchain technology or mechanisms that infuse some transparency in our own transactions, we could also then lower that risk bar or that risk premium by changing the perceptions about African, how we conduct our transactions. And then fourthly, by working on changing the methodologies that are used to assess our credit risk, by including these natural assets, right? Addressing this asymmetry in how these natural assets are used for or against us, we could also then improve our credit rating and reduce the cost of capital. And the cost of capital, so the point here is that the rising cost of capital is a symptom of a deeper problem. And if we address those issues, we can also catalyze investments and address some of the underlying factors that lead to these challenges. So let me stop here, and we'll listen to the others as we move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Pat, for those remarks. I think coupled with the earlier presentation, we definitely have set the foundational basis for some really in-depth discussions. So I'm looking forward to hearing some thought-provoking interventions from the room. And that being said, I will now open up the discussion to the floor for any questions, comments, additions, and if there's any interventions online as well, please feel free to let me know. Do we have any questions? Elizabeth, kicking us off.
Thanks. Thank you both to Sheikh and to Professor Bart, because I think there have been some really important nuances in the current geopolitical context that Professor Bart highlighted, and I think Sheikh made some really important recommendations about moving forward. And I think, if I reflect, so it's not necessarily a question, it's probably more of a comment. If I reflect a little bit on the composition of the G20, and there are two regional organizations now that are members of the G20. The European Union clearly is one that is a more has certain supranational powers and clearly defined mandates through its treaties, etc. The AU is more of an intergovernmental organization, and that's always a challenge. Well, it's a challenge, I think, for both institutions to try to secure consensus. But I think the recommendations that Sheikh has made really would be absolutely essential to ensure that our seat at the table is actually used really, really strategically, with the input and the contribution and the contextualization of all 55 member states. So it is, the AU Commission is the seat holder, together with the rotating chair. And I think the suggestions that Sheikh made about sort of producing a policy briefing or a short summary of the priorities to the incoming chair and the AU is critical. But it is so important, I think, to ensure, and here this reflects also our thinking as an institute over the last couple of years, the importance of bringing in the member states into conversations, not just in the formal processes, but also in dialogues throughout the course of the year, because ultimately a lot of the issues on the agenda of the G20 really speak to global economic governance. And it's the points again that were made. How are we engaging as a collective in the spring meetings and the annual meetings at the African Development Bank, at the WTO? I mean, it's always very difficult because we are 55 countries with very different interests, different economies, therefore different interests, and it's not always easy to agree on certain things. But I would argue, for example, that if one of the priorities, because it is important to determine priorities, we can't do everything. If one of the priorities might be, improving the common framework on debt, on debt treatment, debt sustainability. I now mix up the names. In the context of the G20, I am sure we can arrive at a set of recommendations. In fact, UNECA has already played a really important role in that we can all then, both collectively and individually and bilaterally, drive through these organizations, because sometimes we have a common position, but we don't necessarily always respect it as individual African states. So I would really strongly urge all of us to sort of see how we can contribute, each in our different ways, to some of the recommendations that were made, bearing in mind that this is going to be a particularly difficult global period globally because of geopolitics, war, and changing priorities, financing priorities as well.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for those interventions. Okay. I'll just take all the questions and interventions in one go, and then we'll have a response from our speakers.
Thank you very much. This is Suleiman from Eritrean Embassy. Mine is not of the question, but it's a small observation, because I really believe also the spirit of organizing this kind of roundtable is just to collect a feedback from different perspectives and give a flesh to the entire effort. What we can say is just we wanted to thank and commend also the organizers, as well as the leadership of South Africa in bringing African interest into the agenda in global agenda, and particularly G20. Within the entire process, we really feel one is of paramount importance to understand and being clear with ourselves. As our dear sister Elizabeth was saying, we do have, of course, a variety of capacities in terms of economic development, in terms of priorities, but still also we have a common shared priorities. So understanding ourselves, our own realities, our priorities, our context is very important, because that is where we develop our narrative, a homegrown African narrative. That is very important, because sometimes we allow ourselves into developing a narrative which is developed in other part of the world by forgetting ourselves, by forgetting our realities in the ground. So if we miss that aspect, that is a foundation. If we miss that foundation, we will miss everything. So it is of very important to develop our own narrative, which fits to the purpose, to our realities on the ground, so that we can serve the purpose of our priorities and our interests. So while we are developing our narrative, of course, also using the current context of geopolitical context, which also some of the presenters raised, to our real leverage, by avoiding of allowing ourselves entering into the trap of their competition and the current situation, global situation. That is very relevant, but without getting side to anyone, and without not allowing ourselves into the trap of getting side, but using that geopolitical context to the interest, to the leverage of African agenda is very important. To do so, I think also we need to have, which is also attached to what we have, a foundation, developing a common narrative, that is developing a common position, African position. That is very important, because whenever we have a collective purpose, a collective voice, a collective effort, it makes us more strong and hearable in global agenda. Because when we participate in G20 and such kind of global forums, I think we are not participating in equal footing. To participate in equal footing, to be strong and to serve our purpose, developing African common position in all core issues is very relevant, and that is sorry for taking some time. That's what I can say. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. I think the gentleman next to you also had an intervention. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me also congratulating you for really calling for this roundtable, which reflect the high responsibility from the former chair country of G20. As you know, we are, as an African Union, collectively or individually. It's been the view has been reflected through the chair of the G20 of the previous year, which is really has managed to score a very important point, whether politically or even reflecting that African Union can contribute in all sphere of the G20 positively and also with a very high responsibility. It's coincide with the certain circumstances. We know that we were, as a member state, informed, and also we were a part of the preparation for what would be the voice of African Union within the context of the summit. I believe that the 3 or 4 item as priority set up by the chair of G20 and supported by the African Union, it has been achieved significantly. Now, we would like to thank you very much for drawing our attention to the challenges for the implementation of the outcome. And that is very, very important on individually or on collective aspect. And my colleague from Eritrea has brought, the question of common position as you have presented in your presentation. Now, what would be the best practical step forward to implement the outcome of the G20, taking in account the geopolitical circumstances? In my view, I think it would be very important to table this point in the agenda of African Union, not to leave it, outside, but it will be one of the main point to really drive for a common position by which all of us will defend that common position. It's not going to be easy, but it's very important that we can table it on the level of African Union. Thank you very much for drawing actually our attention to the challenges and what is needed to be done. I think all the presentation has raised questions, but also answers at the same times. Thank you very much. Here I submit. I'm from the Sahrawi Republic.
Thank you so much for those interventions. And I think when okay, I'll take one more hand.
Bonjour à tout le monde.
I always notice when somebody speaks French,
Excusez-moi, je viens d'un pays francophone. Mon nom c'est Mahamadou, de l'ambassade du Mali à Addis Abeba. Je disais que mon nom c'est Mahamadou, de l'ambassade du Mali à Addis Abeba. Je voudrais d'abord remercier les organisateurs de cette session pour avoir organisé cette table ronde qui nous permet d'échanger des points de vue et même peut-être des stratégies par rapport au G20. Ensuite, je voudrais remercier les différents intervenants pour les informations et les pistes de réflexion qu'ils ont distillées au cours de leur intervention. Mais de façon basique, en tant que diplomate et en tant que citoyen africain, je me pose la question, compte tenu du contexte et du bouleversement géopolitique, est-ce que l'agenda du G20 ne pourra-t-il pas être affecté par la crise actuelle au Moyen-Orient? Puis, tout le monde le constate, est en train d'affecter même le quotidien des populations. Et quel est le rôle que l'Union africaine ou le G20 peut-il jouer pour la résolution de cette crise? Je voudrais remercier.
Thank you very much for that question. I think there was one last hand, and then I'll just move on to the online interventions. Okay.
No, thanks very much and good morning. My name is Martin Wins. I'm from the South African Embassy here in Addis Ababa. Just first of all to thank Saya for organizing the roundtable, and of course thank Auda Nepad for also co-sponsoring this event. These two institutions, I think we must not forget that the historic outcome of the G20 was not only through the members of the G20. B20 was also very much heavily involved in creating and setting the agenda. T20 as well. There was also a social summit. So it was a confluence of really an agenda that will live for a long time. I think the challenge now is how do we implement. Now, coming to the presentation by an esteemed colleague from FDB, which is of course also a very active player in the G20 setting, and as an important partner to the African Union as well. I think the practical proposals that he's making are a challenge to us as member states, because the AU, as a member of the G20, has to take a mandate from its member state. So all these practical actions that my esteemed colleagues are mentioning is a challenge now. How do we, as member states, now convert the idea into an intentional, practical proposal going forward? But I must say that a team which is responsible for the G20 is doing a lot in trying to lay the ground for coordination, especially ahead of big meetings. I know that for 3 years now, UNECA and AU have organized working groups in Washington before the fall meetings and spring meetings, just to try and coalesce around common African position on first global financial architect, the reform of global financial architect. So there's already work that is already there. We just need to be intentional and much more deliberate in how we move. The decision was adopted during the assembly in February. Basically, the decision is not just a list of the outcomes of the Johannesburg G20. It's really challenging the member states, RECs, and the AU to implement those outcomes that we need to implement. Not all of the outcomes need to be implemented at a global level. For example, as my brother was talking, the issue of tax reforms, the issue of extending the tax base, these are national competencies. So member states also have a responsibility to take forward the outcomes of the G20. RECs as well, you look at the 8 regions that we have, to what extent are they going to leverage these outcomes to increase the integration, to support the FCFTA. So all of those things are already there. We just need now to implement them. Geopolitics are at a stage where now it's very difficult than it was in November. But I think the environment is such that it is this time that needs more common African position. It requires us to coordinate more. It requires us to leverage all the resources we have to have a common agenda in the G20. With those words, I don't have question. As Ambassador was saying, the presentation provides challenge, but the answer is in the things. The challenge now is how do we, as an institution, as the AU, take forward in terms of now being deliberate and taking decisions to say this must happen. Then it will happen. Thanks very much.
I see we have 2 more hands. I am cognizant of time, but I will indulge just because I know Sheikh will have to run out after this session, and given that the discussions are flowing, I will close it at the 2 hands that we have right now. And I do have some online interventions as well. Maybe before we move to you, ma'am, let me just read those out. The first comment is from Linda online, says, I agree with the pre-alignment idea from the first presentation. It is important that we meet as Africa before going to other G20 nations, as that strengthens our voice. I think an additional layer is how that alignment is carried beyond leadership spaces. At the moment, much of this remains an elite conversation, and that creates a gap between policy direction and public understanding. From a social development perspective, public education becomes critical in sustaining that alignment so that continuity is not only negotiated at the top, but at the societal level. Another comment that came through, UNESCO emphasizes global partnerships as a core strategy to achieve its mission and SDG, particularly SDG 17, which focuses on partnerships for the goals. UNESCO collaborates with diverse stakeholders, including other UN agencies, donors, NGOs, and civil society organizations, to implement its programs and initiatives across education, science, culture, communication, and development. And then the last comment we have says, when talking about Africa leveraging its natural resources for its benefit and development, how do we then reconcile the reality of DRC critical minerals being extracted and shipped to feed the USA industries, employment creation and further economic development as per the agreement that the DRC recently signed with the USA? How long will African countries work individually and in discord with collectivism? Okay, that one is quite provocative, but maybe let's then take additional comments from the room, and then I hope our speakers are also taking notes of some of these comments as well. Do we have a mic? It's just, oh, okay, maybe let's start with you, sir, and then we'll go.
Thank you very much. My name is Tesfaye Boyosa. I'm from the Ethiopian Institute of Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Sai, for organizing this workshop to discuss on the outcome of G20. So, when you look at the outcome of the this G20, of course, the agenda was really reflect the African current reality, including the inequality. Just this is main issue of Africa: debt sustainability, climate finance, especially critical mineral, AI, illicit finance, and the like. These issues really reflect the African issue. And now, so I believe that the outcome was very good. It's really represent the voice of Africa. But my concern, worry that, of course, the outcome is adopted, and then it needs to be the next president should take this agenda into matter. But unfortunately, the successor is United States, and I see only maybe few commonality between current United States and Africa, as maybe only there may be few commonalities, I guess. So it is very difficult to just to see the outcome in the next G20 meeting. For example, what they proposed is economic or trade. The way current United States see economy or trade is also not, I think, it's not the way Africans are aspiring. Energy, for example, currently United States is implementing like drill baby drill, which is about like back to renewable and non-renewable fossil fuels, and a lot of funding is given to the oil companies now more than ever. So Africans are moving like away from this fossil. There is an aspiration, of course, to reach a net zero emission. But the next president, G20, is looking at the energy the world economy is better if it's keep these fossil fuels. So the narrative is really very difficult for Africa as well as for UNFC CCC as well. So I don't know how it's possible to. There is a pre-alignment is very important, which you said. This is very important. So how it is possible to really work with the next president? It is like given the fact that there is much difference on especially the energy, the climate finance, because if the climate issue is hoax, maybe how it is difficult for us. So how this would be really taken into the next presidency. The other is, I think, what the Africa needs to focus in is issue related to, again, climate finance. For example, due to geopolitics now, the inflation, now we are in the state of green inflation as well. For example, one thing which I can say that because of the conflict in Iran, Israel, here in Ethiopia, Ethiopian government is implementing the green mobility, but now it is completely not affordable to do that. So I think this is happening in every African country. So I think generally my concern is that the outcome will not likely succeed to the next president. So I think it's important to work on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We will also be having a session on climate, so maybe some of those issues as well will be dealt with during Alex's session. Then our last question.
Thank you so much. My name is Tlalane Sebeko. I am from the Embassy of Lesotho in Addis Ababa. I would like to take this floor in my personal capacity, if that is at all possible, because I'm looking at generally the multilateral system that we operate under, and looking at the AU and all its programs and how we set all these goals and almost always fail to achieve them. And then I do not want to talk about G20 in particular, but generally as a program, as a platform on its own, now bringing into the AU agenda, how we are going to then institutionalize, implement, and move forward with the outcomes, with the outcomes of the G20 and of the recent summit, from which the outcomes of the G20 were adopted. I'm just thinking as a Mosotho, as an African person, individual, how we intend to bring forward. Are we not bringing too much into agenda of the AU in this regard? I am going to make an example that we are in the middle of the reforms as the AU. How will then this agenda of the G20 fit into the AU agenda? Also, we have had so many of these programs. I'm going to make an example also of the Ezulwini consensus. That is now, we are now stagnant with it, going forward in the UN, trying to push forward for the reformation of the UN Charter. Now we bring in now the issue. Like I said, I'm not going to talk specifically about the G20, but I'm just trying to say generally we are bringing too many. We are playing from too many goalposts. Will we ever find a common ground? Will we ever have something tangible that we say from this particular beautifully written program? We have a tangible, long-term, sustainable outcome. As Africa, I'm just throwing this out there, as Africans and as Africa, and especially because now G20 plays at a global level. How are we practically going to fit this into our own system when the entire UN system itself seems to be failing us as Africans? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think very fitting of the last question to the speakers. I think just let me first start with Sheikh to maybe come in with your remarks, responses. I think the fact that majority of the interventions that we had were mostly comments and adding to the discussion really shows that you hit the important points in terms of invoking that kind of discussion, particularly around issues of coordination and the importance of identifying priorities. I think that featured quite mainly in many of the interventions and comments. And maybe I think there was also a question around how the geopolitics or the geopolitical environment may be affecting the G20 agenda, as well as the last question around inundating the AU agenda. You have the floor to speak to any of those questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Just checking if you're still able to hear me.
Yes, we still are.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for all the comments. I took some copious notes. I think if I were to summarize it, overall, there's always like, we know the what, it's always about the how. And I think from the last intervention, and the biggest question that I got is, given the way the world is working today, the geopolitical situation, the need for us to speak with one voice, the biggest question for me is the African Union today designed in a way that can respond to this, in a way that can participate actively so that Africa's voice is heard in the international institutions, and Africa can play its role. So there's a bigger question in terms of the AU modus operandi and whether that can respond to today's geopolitical situation and tomorrow's position where Africa needs to play a larger role. And I think those are bigger questions that I think needs to be continually discussed and should be placed front and center in the ongoing African Union reforms, because I really do think that with the AU has a role to play in terms of being very agile, very nimble, very responsive, very timely in its interventions, in its advocacy, and also making sure that it has the right policymakers, the right stakeholders, giving them the right information at the right time. That is on itself quite a daunting task, but I think everybody has a role to play in integrating them into the overall international agenda. I think that the comrade from Mali had asked a question about whether the G20 agenda is going to be affected. Yes, it is going to be affected. If I draw on my experience having participated at the G20 in 2022 under the Indonesian G20 presidency, the agenda was affected by the war in Ukraine. It happened in February 2022. They had just taken over the G20 presidency, and that completely impacted the way in which we conducted our businesses. For example, one of the strong outcomes of a good G20 meeting is the issuance of what's called a communique at all the finance minister and central bank governor meetings. We failed to have communiques at the main G20 FMCBG meetings because of disagreement on particular language condemning the war in Ukraine. We found a political compromise to have a leaders' declaration in November at the Bali summit in November 2022. But every single other working group had only what's called a chair summary, meaning there were fundamental disagreements on topics that were more geopolitical. So we could see some of that playing out. We could also see it specifically playing out in terms of maybe based on the priorities, perhaps energy will become more front and center, because today that is what the geopolitical implications are. And it's very important in this moment for the African Union to really speak under one voice and talking about what is going to be really the impact on our energy supplies, on inflation, on our macroeconomic environments, because countries now are taking more fiscal space. If they're maintaining the price of oil at the pump at a particular price, it means you're subsidizing oil and gas, and therefore you're reducing your fiscal space, and therefore you're not able to do infrastructure investments in healthcare and education, which are some of the things that can lead to Africa's sustainable development. So these are some of the ways in which now the language, the dynamics are shifting, and now we need to be really thoughtful and really methodic about how we deliver that message in our only window that we have today, which is the African Union engagement at the G20. Given the fact that South Africa is not actively participating this year, so Africa's voice, even at the representation, is a bit diminished. Donc, pour le camarade du Mali, j'espère que la réponse en anglais vous suffira, mais vraiment, l'agenda va être très affecté par cela, comme je l'ai expliqué aux collègues en anglais. And then finally, I think, tactically speaking, one of the recommendations, what we can do today in engaging with the US presidency is making sure that we're actively participating in the working groups. I think, Keza, in your intervention, you mentioned we have 4 working groups. We need to make sure that we are in those working groups. We need to make sure that the policy briefings happen, that the right institutions, whether the AFDB, UNECA, the think tanks, civil society. One of the comrades from South Africa did mention a lot of the work that the B20 done, the T20, civil society. They all need to continue to play the role. I think what South Africa has really demonstrated is that when we create together, when we bring policy, business, civil society organization, we can really create something that is much bigger than ourselves, and that can be sustained. We need to find a way to continue to have those voices in the policy recommendations. Even if it's financial or technically sound, I think they can always find their way to the policy briefing and ensure that we have consistent messaging on that. The African Engagement Framework was particularly created for this reason, to make sure that no matter the presidency, no matter the topic, we always have priorities in which we can constructively engage with the presidency. One of the other things that we should be happening in the background is also engaging with the upcoming UK G20 presidency. This is something that at the African Development Bank today we're already doing in the background. We are trying to work with the US in different settings and the heads of MDBs to work on MDB reform topics. We're also trying to engage bilaterally with the United States, but also engaging proactively also with the upcoming UK G20 presidency, setting up their priorities, aligning with them on topics, and see how we can help driving some of those agendas forward, especially particularly, as I mentioned, on the cost of capital. How do we scale guarantees, credit enhancement facilities? How do we more create a domestic capital market so that we can de-risk the currency risk, which is one of the impediments to having for growth? And then so deepening the local capital markets, domestic resource mobilization, private capital mobilization. Those are all topics we're actively engaging with the UK as they're thinking about what is going to be the themes for the presidency and the different working groups that are going to come after. So we have our work cut out for us, but I think with the continued engagement of the community, the diplomatic community, the business community, the civil society organizations, I really think that we can continue to engage. But the message is we need to engage. We need to engage at the right level. We need to engage on time. We need to engage in a systematic manner so that we can continue to build that institutional memory and consistent messaging overall. And then with that, I want to thank SIIA again for the opportunity to speak, or thank again all the participants for their thoughtful questions, and hopefully the discussions can continue in a fruitful manner. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Chef, for also making the time to be with us and really adding value to the discussions. I know you have to run out, but thank you so much once again for being with us. I think so we'll now go and receive Prof. Bud's remarks. Concluding remarks and response, and then we'll have a short tea break before we proceed on to the next segment of our program. Off to you, Prof. Bud.
Do I need to come over there? Yeah, yeah. Let me speak from there. Yes. No, I will conclude by going back to the last question, which was about the fact that we are flooding our plate with too many issues and it's getting confusing. In principle, I agree, but I think it's more about how we are packaging our messaging rather than the fact that we're doing so many things. It is true to some extent we are doing a lot. But for example, if we take the engagement framework, it is actually drawn from existing priorities and concerns, including the Agenda 2063. A lot of the things we've talked about are not new. Cost of capital, investments, they are the same old issues. But sometimes we package them differently so people don't understand what's the link between the framework and the Agenda 2063. The common person, barely is grappling with 2063, let alone the engagement framework. So really, we need to be more strategic in our messaging so as not to confuse the audience, right? Giving different names to different to the same issues. Second, the issue of speaking with one voice, we all know the what. It's true, it's an important thing. But how do we make it easy for everybody to know what these common issues are? So, for example, I mean, when I was during the last presidency, you have conversations and you have to sort of make a presentation. And when you make that presentation, you need to know what the African position is. For the other groups from the other countries, they have a mechanism from which they draw information from. And I think that now in this era of AI, we should be able to at least have a database of African common positions on key issues so that if an individual is sitting in a G20 meeting and wants to access that information, he can do so very easily using our technology, having this. So we need to organize our information so that people can be effective spokespersons for Africa on these very important issues. Thirdly, we also need to move our discussions a little bit beyond the what into the tactical strategies on the how, right? So, for example, looking at specific policy gaps that inhibit lack of investments, what is it that we can do to address these? And some of these lessons are really around the table. They are in countries that have experiencing challenges and have identified solutions. So that is also critical to moving the conversation forward. The fifth point I'd like to make is that in these events, these meetings, you don't always get everybody agreeing with an African position. But the tactics is to build a coalition of the willing, right? We need to know who at the table is really behind us and galvanize our movement around that group. So building a coalition of the willing is a critical tactic in terms of getting our positions heard. And then lastly, I think we need to separate the issues that we need to work with and deal with as Africans from the ones that require this external engagement so that we don't conflate the two. I think sometimes the discussions, we conflate the two. So different platforms should speak to different kinds of issues. The ones that require external engagement should be based on issues that are, that require that kind of engagement. So in a nutshell, I'd like to say that, yes, we've started, that we're new to the G20 table, but I think that given our capacities and the lack of the machinery that other countries have, I think we've really made very good progress. And sometimes when we are very critical of ourselves, the others tell us, oh, wow, but we thought you guys were really prepared. So I think, yes, we tend to be hard on ourselves, but I think we can also do better leveraging technology and working better together. So I thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks, Prof. Bart. Particularly, I'll highlight two main points around the importance of strategic messaging, as well as building the coalitions of the willing, and being able to recognize progress where progress has been made. I think with that being said, I will end here in terms of the first segment of our program. We will take a 15-minute break. We'll be back here at 11:30. I'm assuming it's GMT for the benefit of the participant, GMT +3 of the participants online. So we're just going to take the short recess and then continue with the rest of our program for the day. Thank you very much for your engagement and your energy.
Please join us for tea in the back, coffee.
Well, organizers still in the room. Can we maybe do a sound check? Just make sure that I'm able to come through now.
Hi, Alex, we can hear you. Let's maybe just wait for the technical people to just put you on the screen so that we can make sure that we see you.
And we can hear you online as well.
Okay, we can see you. Maybe speak.
Testing.
Okay, good
Can hear you
online.
loud and clearly.
Hear me in the room. Okay, fantastic. I'll stand by until we reconvene after the tea break.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alex.
My colleagues have been yes, Alex and Robin. My YouTube so much. One on the parking. That's the one. We're trying. So we are hoping to come here in May. So you'll hear from staff. Yeah. Another one has but there is
For the colleagues online, we are about to start. May I just kindly confirm that we have Prof. Jayati online?
Yes, I'm online.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much once again, colleagues. We will now proceed to the second and final segment of our program. I think in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead as some colleagues are still grabbing some refreshments. Just a couple of things to note in terms of some changes to our program, at least in terms of the sequencing. Right now at 11:30, we will be having our presentation on the inequality report from Professor Jayati Ghosh. Thereafter, we will have our presentation from Alex in terms of the reflections on the G20 Just Energy Transition Agenda, as well as the Sustainable Finance Agenda. We will then take a Q&A in terms of those two specific agenda items. I know Prof has to run out at some point during the discussions, just to make note of that as well. After our Q&A session, we will then hear a recorded presentation from Kathy Nicolau-Manis on illicit financial flows and how that agenda has developed under the Development Working Group, and an update beyond the call of action, which was adopted at that time. As Elizabeth will be our last and final speaker of the day, we thought it would be best to just consolidate her two sessions, which is the one on the Ubuntu Commission on Global Public Goods, as well as with her closing remarks, just to catch up on the time as well. We'll then have a Q&A, maybe post to Elizabeth. If we have the time for that. Without further ado, I will now hand over to Prof. Jayati to speak to the inequality report. Over to you.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this. And thank you, Elizabeth, for inviting me to this. I've listened to some of the discussion. It's been extremely interesting. Can I just begin with some remarks as a non-African who was privileged to attend the G20 summit? I cannot tell you how impressive it was. And I have attended several before this, and I was really struck by the very inclusive and progressive agenda that you managed to generate. The fact that you got together not just South Africa, but so many other African countries involved in the process, in the different working groups. And that you managed to get a resolution in the face of opposition from the United States, which I think was a remarkable diplomatic feat. Many delegations told me they were actually getting phone calls from Washington saying you are not to have a resolution. So I think, the fact that you managed that at all is really remarkable, and that it was broadly a good resolution. And also that you have since moved to take the initiative beyond the G20. So I just want to express my respect, and I think the respect of the entire developing world, for this first African G20 summit, and the fact that you really made G20 seem relevant to us. Brazil first, and you made G20 seem relevant to the rest of the developing world, which it hasn't seemed for a while. So I just want to congratulate you on this. I was privileged to be part of the G20 Inequality Committee that was set up by the South African Presidency with Professor Joseph Stiglitz as the chair. And we did present a report. We were fortunate to present it to both the Sherpa meeting and to the G20 Leaders Summit. And I have to confess, it was absolutely surprising to us, the positive response that we got. We didn't expect such a positive response. I don't know how many of you have read the report, but it's, let me be honest, it's a fairly damning report on the state of inequality. We have called it an inequality emergency. We have said that it's a massive problem, not only because of the fact that it is associated with increased poverty and fragility among the poor, but because of the immense concentration of both income and wealth in that globally, which is actually historically unprecedented, that has enabled a few extremely powerful individuals and corporations to influence laws, legislations, regulations, policies in their own favor and further add to inequality, and is now a threat to our democracy because it creates resentment, frustration among the poor, it creates extremely unequal and unjust societies, but it also reinforces itself in the ways that I have mentioned, particularly because of the power of the extremely rich. We also saw that this was not just something that has happened because of different events or episodes or processes. This was the result of policies. So our report is very clear that inequality is a policy choice and therefore a political choice. Now, given all of this and given the kinds of things that we have talked about in terms of both global inequality and within country inequality, we were very surprised to get a positive response from a lot of countries. In the Sherpa meeting, we didn't really get any negative responses, but in the actual summit, we were very happy to note that at least 11 leaders who presented, and I think you get only 4 minutes each, referred to that committee's report and supported it. And we had a number of, I mean, there were many, many recommendations, of course, in terms, well, there were many drivers of inequality. I'm not going to go into all of them. The report is not very long and it's available for everyone to read. But we saw that those drivers directly led to certain kinds of policy initiatives, both nationally and internationally. And they relate both to universal provision of good quality public services, a focus on employment generation as a goal of public policy, with growth as just an outcome rather than as a goal. A focus on basic needs provision for everyone. And of course, that really means that the fiscal strategies have to change. We have to move away from regressive to progressive taxation. And that in turn means taxing wealth and taxing multinational corporations fairly, which requires, of course, international cooperation to some extent, but can also be done at national levels. And we suggested a number of other national initiatives as well. We've also talked about the global architecture in terms of intellectual property regime and things like this. Now, these were among the general policy recommendations, but our primary recommendation was the setting up of an international panel on inequality, because we felt that this is something that can be done immediately. And we saw it along the lines of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Ours is not intended to be intergovernmental. It's meant to be international. We are envisaging an independent panel of experts supported by governments and by the international bodies, but completely independent, that would play the role the IPCC has played in terms of providing a consensus view on what is exactly happening. That is in terms of the actual extent of it, the measures, the metrics we use, the kinds of ways in which we can measure it, the multidimensional aspects of it, the drivers of it, the processes that have generated it, the policies that have been undertaken in different countries, the extent to which they have worked, why they haven't worked, whether they can be replicated. So a number of these things, we believe an international panel on inequality can play a very important role. Most of all, if you remember, before the IPCC started coming out with its reports, people didn't really know about climate change. It wasn't really recognized. It wasn't even accepted among policymakers. I'm getting some feedback. I'm not sure from where, but maybe if we can turn off the sound in the room, in the mic in the room. Sorry about that. But so we feel that this panel can play a similar role, create awareness, create understanding, create greater consensus about data and about analysis as well, and therefore enable both governments and people to demand different policies, different structures, different institutions, and different regulations. I'm very happy to say that this has been taken forward by the government of South Africa. President Ramaphosa and the government have been extraordinarily supportive and have really been the champions of this. And we have very recently had the first meeting of what we're now calling a founding committee for the international panel, which includes 4 champion governments: South Africa, Brazil, Spain, and Norway. We have expressions of interest from several other governments. The African Union, I'm delighted to say, in a meeting in February, endorsed this and has put their full support behind this as well. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has endorsed this. We have endorsements also and active proposals of engagement with a number of other international organizations, the ILO, UNRWA, UNCTAD, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF. So in other words, pretty much all the international organizations are also agreed that this would be a very useful thing. This is just a start, and we are not suggesting that this is going to solve the problem. This is actually just going to bring it out into the fore and enable people and countries and governments and civil society to work towards solving the problem. And so I just want to share that I think this is one of the very important initiatives that the South African G20 presidency undertook, which is going to have a life way beyond the G20. And there is hope. We have requested, and we believe that Secretary General will support this, to have a UN General Assembly resolution that would recognize the problem of inequality and would not necessarily situate this panel in the UN, but would say that this panel could report to different UN bodies, whether it is ECOSOC or it is the GA or it is the high-level political forum or different, or even the G20 itself. I want to just pick up, so this is on the International Panel on Inequality. I want to pick up on another aspect that I think Elizabeth has also been involved in, which is the Food Security Task Force, in which, a lot of I was also involved in presenting a paper for that, in which some of us had argued for regional cooperation in particular to deal with the immense problems coming from massive food and fuel price volatility. And so we had argued, we had made a specific case for an African grain management initiative, effectively a regional level buffer stock, which would be along the lines of what already exists in China, India, Brazil, other countries, which have continuous procurement and distribution. But this would be multinational. This would be across the African Union. And we had a sort of more detailed plan about how it would work. It may come as no surprise that this was actively opposed by the G7 members of that particular committee, who objected that this was against WTO rules, which is a little surprising considering that the European Union has itself set up its own stockpiling strategy, which explicitly names food, fuel, strategic minerals, and a whole range of other things as things that they will stockpile. But I do believe this is something that can be taken forward at the regional level. Because after that meeting, which, it didn't find its way into the document because the G7 members opposed it, but I did meet with several African representatives who said that they would support this. So I think this is something the African Union could definitely take forward on its own as an initiative coming out of that. And the other one, particularly, is tax cooperation. I know you're going to have a discussion on illicit financial flows, but the Africa group has been absolutely fundamental in moving the tax discussions to the UN negotiations. And they are the ones who are still really fighting for getting developing country voices heard. Now, I think the significance of this is perhaps lost on a bunch of other countries. So I would earnestly request Africa to be much more proactive in engaging other developing countries in pushing the agenda, particularly, for example, in public country-by-country reporting, which is absolutely essential for anything you want to do, whether it is taxing multinationals, taxing the rich, stopping illicit financial flows. You cannot do that without the information. The current OECD system does not provide this to all countries, and most African countries are denied the information. It is absolutely critical to have public country-by-country reporting. The African Union did raise the problem, but since nobody else took it up, they have stopped raising it. I think you have to keep raising it. And I think you really have to build coalitions of other countries to insist that this be part of the Framework Tax Convention. The importance of transparency and particularly of public country-by-country reporting. Thanks very much. Okay, now I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Ah, okay, great. Thank you very much, Prof, for those remarks. And you actually got some claps from around the room, which means, which was a positive sign that your presentation really touched on some pertinent points. So thank you very much for those interventions and also highlighting issues on food security and international tax cooperation as well, which are quite key on the African agenda. I think we'll now move on to Alex's presentation, and then we'll have our Q&A right after that. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks. Just to confirm again that you can hear me in the room.
Loud and clearly. Thank you.
Excellent. I'll jump straight into it. Sorry about those technical difficulties we were experiencing earlier this morning. So in my presentation, I want to keep it short, and I want to focus on the context, of course, of the South African G20 discussions on just energy transition and sustainable finance agenda and climate agenda, what actually happened in the negotiations, and then that critical question of sustaining momentum. I think, it's already come up this morning. We're all broadly aware of a very difficult multilateral environment in 2025. That's broadly for the multilateral environment, and then that was further compounded by the specific bilateral tensions between the US and South Africa. But I think the point to make is all of this was even more true and even more impactful for discussions around climate change and energy transition and sustainable finance. We're all aware the US has pulled out of the Paris Agreement. Trump has consistently referred to climate change as a hoax or a scam. We're familiar with the drill baby drill narrative. I do think it's worth mentioning that while the US, of course, had an outside influence in terms of how the G20 played out on climate and energy transition, there were other dynamics at play as well. And we saw that in the interventions that came in from Argentina, some highly fossil fuel dependent countries. And then I think also to recognize that, the concerns around commitments on climate finance and scaling of climate finance in the context of European shift to defense priorities, all of these factors played into quite a challenging environment when it came to negotiations on climate and energy transition. Of course, under that theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainability for the South African G20 presidency, South Africa was very clear that it would prioritize African continental priorities and broader global South priorities. Did we see that reflected in the climate and energy agenda as it was laid out by the South African presidency? I think certainly yes. We saw in the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group an emphasis on adaptation and resilience building, loss and damage, just transition, and financing, all issues that have been highlighted through African Union bodies, policy frameworks like the African Climate Change and Resilience Development Strategy, messaging that has come through the African Climate Summits. Similarly, in the Energy Transitions Working Group, a strong emphasis on just, affordable, and inclusive energy transitions, people-centered transitions, critically also energy access, and then diverse local supply chains. And this spoke to the point about critical minerals, which has already come up this morning. Finally, just briefly on sustainable finance, we saw there very specifically also an emphasis on scaling financing for adaptation and for just transitions, in addition to a few other priorities in that working group. And then, of course, tying this together in various streams and elements of the G20's work is this broader concern around debt sustainability, including how debt sustainability translates to issues around climate and energy transition financing. And this echoes messaging, I think, that we already saw emerge in the first African Climate Summit in Nairobi, and that was was echoed in last year's African Climate Summit in Addis again. Now, of course, the negotiations were not easy. The US did not participate in a number of the initial working group meetings. Certainly for the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group discussions, they then re-engaged in the final working group meetings. And that, in addition to some of these broader dynamics, multilateral dynamics that I referred to in the beginning, essentially meant that all the language that had been carefully negotiated through the course of the year around climate, inclusive energy transitions within the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group could not find its way into a ministerial statement. It was expressed as a chair's summary. There were two ministerial statements. Typically, you would just have one ministerial statement emerging from a working group. But I think almost as a risk mitigation strategy, those were divided into two statements so that, if they couldn't move ahead, possibly at least one of those could emerge. In the end, we had a ministerial declaration on air quality and a ministerial declaration on crimes affecting the environment. We saw similar dynamics play out in the other working groups, sustainable finance, energy transitions, and some of the other working groups where we were not able to secure a ministerial outcome document. But I think relatively strong chairs statements, chair summaries that nevertheless could reflect on the dialogue and emphasize certain priorities that were important both for South Africa and I think from the continental perspective. And then this dynamic of the US not participating in the G20 summit itself. So even though we saw that in the working group where climate change is most prominent, which is the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group, even though we saw explicit language on climate and energy transition blocked in that forum, we could see that language be reinserted within the leaders' declaration. And I think that is very significant because, of course, what this signals is not only, I think, some very astute diplomacy on behalf of South Africa and South Africa's priority, but it signals that all the remaining G20 members were willing to come on board, even in light of it was broadly understood that the US had specifically indicated that there shouldn't be a leaders' declaration. And of course, the US opposition to language on climate and energy transition was well understood. Despite that, we could see this language reinserted. And I think some of the key priorities, both from a global South perspective and an African perspective, we are seeing it there. A commitment to the UNFCCC process, a commitment to the Paris Agreement, some of the key targets there, referencing the goal of tripling renewable energy by 2030, the emphasis on a whole of economy, whole of society approach, a just transition, and inclusive transition, specifically reference to the relationship to climate and debt sustainability, strong language on critical minerals and cooperation around that. Of course, the core priority for the African continent there is that those minerals are promoting industrialization, that they're processed, that they're contributing to green technology value chains on the continent, and that we are not just exporting our critical mineral ores to create jobs and support industrialization elsewhere. So that language is there. And of course, strong language on scaling finance in various dimensions as it relates to climate and energy transitions. I do think it's worth noting the language around the energy transition. And noteworthy there is, I think particularly now in the context of what we're seeing unfold this year, a very strong emphasis on energy security. So yes, emphasizing the importance of a just energy transition and climate action, but making very clear that these goals must be pursued in the context of the importance of energy security. And there's language about technologically neutral, integrated, inclusive approaches to energy security and energy transitions, respecting the different pathways that are going to be pursued, but in that context, also putting the emphasis on technological cooperation, on financing and other forms of support. I won't go too much detail into the language there. We might revisit it a little bit in the Q&A. But really then, where to from here? How do we sustain momentum? It already came up this morning. We're all aware that climate change is not going to feature on the agenda of the US G20 presidency. It's a massively scaled down structure. There is a working group on energy security, energy abundance, the energy abundance working group. Now, South Africa has not been invited to participate. The AU is going to be in the room. And I think a key question, and I think a priority here, is to ensure that even in the face of this very particular and narrow framing of the G20 agenda and energy, the energy agenda within the US, it's still important for the Global South, for the AU, Global South G20 members, to emphasize that if we're talking about energy abundance, then we must also talk about renewable energy and scaling renewable energy. In fact, the African Climate Summit process has emphasized that Africa needs to go beyond the goal of tripling renewable energy capacity on the context. So finding opportunities, even within the limitations of the US G20 presidency, I think needs to be pursued. I think there are lessons to be learned in terms of working effectively on coordination and messaging. This also came up earlier this morning. Continentally, we already have a strong structure. We've got the Committee of African Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. We've got the Africa Group of Negotiators. We've got the African Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy as an overall policy framework. And of course, the outcomes of the African Climate Summit process. So there is a strong framework and a relatively cohesive and structured messaging, which we should seek opportunities to emphasize. But then, of course, I would say it is going to be necessary to think around not only to think beyond the US G20 presidency this year. There's already been talk this morning about working very closely with the UK around their upcoming presidency. And I think, in fact, this presents an opportunity to the AU, but to other members of the G20 as well. Because the reality is that the process of developing an agenda is often quite truncated because you've got these rolling one-year presidencies. And so the ability to start very early engaging with the UK around how Africa's climate and energy priorities can be reflected in the UK G20 presidency, I think is really a strategic opportunity. That is not to say that we should write off the US G20 presidency. I think we should continue engagement. There is opportunities for also business communities and the private sector to engage, and we should seek opportunities for alignment there. But at the same time, look beyond, and then even outside of the G20 process, how we tie in some of the momentum, some of the technical work that's been done out of the South African G20 presidency into other processes. And we've seen with things like Mission 300 that there are still opportunities to unlock significant finance, to unlock significant technical support for Africa's energy and climate priorities. So it's identifying those alliances, thinking about those kind of minilateral or initiative-driven processes where progress can be made. So I'll pause my comments there and we'll take it further in the discussion, I hope.
Highlight a few points which I thought were worth noting, particularly around the opportunities even with the narrow agenda of energy abundance under the US presidency, and the fact that, such a conversation cannot be had without, renewables, for instance, being part of that discussion. And in terms of also the point around starting early, in terms of engaging, setting an agenda with incoming presidencies as well. That being said, I will now open up the floor for any questions, comments, whether directed to Alex or Jayati, and then we can move on to the online comments if there is any. Do we have any questions in the room or comments? Prof. Pat, yes.
Thanks for the presentation. Mine is simply to look at another area of energy where perhaps Africa can benefit, and it's in the area of carbon credits. If you, for example, look at our health sector, we depend a lot on diesel fuels to power our health sector, which undermines operational efficiencies, undermines health outcomes. But this challenge, there's a potential upside to it. In other words, there's a potential to generate carbon credits by decarbonizing the health sector, which globally, if it were a country with the data that's available, would be the fifth largest emitter, accounting for about 4.4% of total greenhouse gas emissions. So I think there's a discussion to be had about how do we turn that challenge into an opportunity, but it also relates to the price of carbon. In other words, when you sequester a ton of carbon from the system, how much you actually get paid. You know that the prices in the voluntary market are different from in the non-voluntary market, and that also has implications for the kinds of projects and the profitability of those kinds of projects. So I think we need to also see how we factor that into the whole discussion. Of course, we know that, yeah, there's a pushback against green and all that, but looking forward, it's an area that I think should be strategic for Africa in terms of the benefits of decarbonization.
Thank you, Prof. We have another question.
Thank you very much. Just on the issue of energy, we do have the current narrative is just to use a critical minerals on renewable energy transition. Or from another perspective, being developing countries, which also sometimes we need in areas which from training areas, which are very far countryside areas, maybe it would not be enough to have also renewable energy transition. So should we use critical energy, for instance, wherever we have a chance, for instance, let's say critical minerals, including the uranium, to develop a clean energy for Africa, or shall we use this critical minerals in energy transition? Because as Sam is either it might not be in high scale to have fully needed industrial level energy, or also it might not cover all of our countries. So should we think of using critical minerals to having clean energy at industrial level, or shall we limit ourselves in using critical minerals just to have just full renewable energy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, one more.
Thank you very much. I have one question. It's maybe for Alex, or just it's about climate as well as, of course, it's related to also that sustainability. So many African leaders now is advocating for climate debt swap. The idea is that because of climate change, many African economy is affected. So because of that, many countries are failing to pay back the debt. So there is an advocacy on climate debt swap, and how much is that become the common African position maybe at G20 or at other platform as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Elizabeth, did you have one? Okay. There's a mic right there. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on two of the points that Jayati raised. The first, which I thought is very important, and I mean, you've done much more work on this, and so correct me if I've got my stats wrong. But you made a point about the tax convention negotiations, and the fact that obviously we need a global framework. It's going to be very, very challenging to get one, but that nevertheless there are also actions and there's agency that African countries at a national level can adopt. And I think that's so important to actually reiterate. And I remember when I think it was in 2021, when there was some agreement that came out of the G20 and then fed into the OECD around the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I think there'd been some research in Kenya that had indicated that if Kenya adopted the digital services tax that had been agreed at the global level, they would only be able to tax 10 or 11 companies. And under their arrangement, they were able to tax 88 or something like that. The figures couldn't be correct, or may not be correct. But I think the important point here is that there are things we can do at the national level, but it would be very important and would be much more powerful if there is collective action at the national level in Africa. In other words, we all have to institute our own tax legislation, but we need to do it in a coordinated manner. So that was just one observation that I thought was worth highlighting. And then I thought your point about growth as an outcome rather than as a goal, I think is so crucial. You know, we've been talking both last year and obviously the American presidency has already done that, about narrowing the focus, you know, that the G20's focus has become very, very broad. And the American position is let's go back to basics. But going back to basics, the basics of 2008 are not the basics of 2026. You know, your inequality report highlights that, you know, if there's one thing that we're certain about is that inequality, apart from death and taxes, is that inequality is is going to continue to rise on the current trajectory. And one of the things I've been sort of trying to articulate is that I think it is important to narrow the G20, to focus the G20 agenda a little bit more, but not to go back to a global financial agenda, but that rather we recognize that the global financial agenda or financial architecture is an instrument of development. So that you're looking at global economic governance through the prism of development rather than through the prism of a very financialized system. So those were just two comments. You can make some responses to that if you have.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. I think given that was the last comment in the room, Jayati, I'll give you an opportunity to give your responses as well as concluding remarks before we move on to Alex.
Sure. Thank you very much. And yes, Elizabeth, I couldn't agree with you more that there is certainly we need the multilateral negotiations, but there is really huge scope for a lot to be done nationally, and particularly if countries in Africa combine to do it regionally in a coordinated way. And one of the things that, you mentioned the example of the digital service tax, but one way of dealing with the taxation of multinationals, we've been fighting for formulary apportionment for a very long time. The OECD gave a watered down version. It didn't work. It's anyway very complicated. But Nigeria has recently introduced what they call a fractional apportionment, which is a rather simple scheme. It says, look, here is the margin, the profit margin of a particular multinational on something it is providing us. This is the global profit margin. These are its revenues in Nigeria. We are going to apply that profit margin to our revenues and tax that the same way we would tax a domestic company. I think that's actually quite a smart, clever move, which is easy to calculate for a country. It is something other African countries could emulate. If lots of African countries do it, it puts that much more pressure in the UN in the tax negotiations for them to actually concede this as a useful and viable way to go. And it can actually generate significant revenues. So there are already initiatives which you can really learn from one another, but it would be so good if Africa can coordinate these and do them together in a way. And on the other point about growth, what can I say? I think we're all in agreement on this. But essentially, we have to make the economy serve society, people, and the planet. And we have stopped doing that. And that means a restructuring and a reorganization of all of our economic strategies across the world. Once again, this is something that is best done together, and it requires lots of little things to be done in different ways. But, in a way, I really feel in terms of regional unity and coordination, the African Union has shown many of the other regions of the world much more initiative and possibility than certainly we see anywhere else. And I think, therefore, it's much more possible in Africa today. Thanks so much.
Shall I jump in? Okay, I think I'm going to take the liberty to just respond to the questions that were posed to me. I want to make two quick comments first before I go to the specific questions. And that is just to go a little bit deeper in the critical minerals work. So I would encourage everyone to please have a look at the G20 critical minerals framework that was developed under the South African G20 presidency. I think that's an important piece of work. There is ongoing discussions around how that might feed into some of the G7 discussions under France this year. It is a voluntary framework. Obviously, it has its limitations, but it's a step forward. And then just to reiterate what's happening on the continent, I think many in the room would be aware of this, just in case. We, of course, had the production or the publication of the African Green Minerals Strategy last year. So that speaks precisely, there was that comment about the DRC-US agreement. It speaks precisely to the industrialization and processing objectives, and there's important work also under the African Mineral Development Center, the specialized agency of the AU. We ourselves are, in fact, working with the AMDC on the African Green Minerals Observatory, which is a fantastic platform that I really do encourage those in the room to please have a look at and explore. You can always engage with us if you have questions about that. So then more specifically to the questions. Carbon markets. Carbon markets was one of the priority themes in the Sustainable Finance Working Group. Again, no ministerial statement, but there was very important technical work undertaken last year. There was a voluntary carbon credit data model developed. Of course, one of the challenges with carbon markets is ensuring trust in the data and ensuring the integrity of those carbon markets. So there's a lot of technical work. There was some progress last year that needs to be continued. The Sustainable Finance Working Group has the advantage of having a kind of permanent secretariat support through the UNDP. So I think that's an important channel through which to take these conversations forward and advance that work. The question around critical minerals, what exactly is a critical mineral? How do we think about critical minerals in the context of energy security and African energy priorities? Uranium was mentioned. Look, I think the principle, and we saw it in the Leaders' Declaration, was diverse pathways. So there is a kind of first principle respect that countries and regions have the leeway to assess what their priorities are and recognize that energy security and development and energy access is a critical part of the equation when we talk about energy transition and the role of critical minerals. Precisely how Africa kind of pursues its critical minerals in terms of the energy access dimension and the value chains, I think it's going to be a mixed picture. There's certainly a lot of opportunities right now that we're seeing to scale renewable energy, new wind projects, massive scaling up of solar, of battery technology. And the reality is 80 to 90% of that production currently is in China. So part of the scaling and energy transition in the short and medium term is going to rely on imported technology. What we need to do then, and we're already seeing this debate quite advanced, is to look at where those opportunities are to move on both ends. So from your critical minerals, or you want to try and move up the minerals processing scale. Sometimes that means just processing to a first level of concentrates, and those concentrates for the time being still being exported. And then on the other end, can you, instead of importing completed solar panels, for example, is there an opportunity to import components and then to at least do some assembly on the continent? And then over time, working from both ends, you're trying to increase the share of that value chain, the green jobs that are being created that are located on the African continent. But there are some realities of clean tech value chains at the moment, I think, that we have to accept, even while we work towards shifting those realities over the longer term. And then debt for climate. This is certainly an area that has a lot of potential. I know organizations like the Nature Conservancy are already in discussions with a few African governments around launching some proposals. The work does get quite technical in terms of it has a lot to do with the way the debt is structured. But I think maybe what can be said at this point is, let's make sure that from an African continental perspective, we continue to drive both the political and the technical work. And we've got a lot of capacity in institutions like the African Development Bank and in other continental institutions on the technical side to drive forward momentum in this area. So I think this is definitely something that Africa should continue at a continental to be pushing forward. Thank you.
Remarks. I think we'll now swiftly move on to the next section, which is on the illicit financial flows. Kathy, who was an advisor under the Development Working Group and is an illicit financial flows expert, was unfortunately unable to join us, but she did kindly prepare a nice short presentation for us in terms of that agenda. Do we have the video ready?
My name is Kathy Nicolau-Manius, and I'm a regional technical advisor on the African continent focusing on illicit financial flows. Last year, I was the technical lead on illicit financial flows for South Africa's G20 Development Working Group. We were instrumental in supporting the outcomes for the G20 with a ministerial declaration. On IFF specifically, we also provided inputs into the F54 and also into the UNGA General Assembly resolution, which was adopted at the end of last year. Today's session, I'm going to focus specifically on why we prioritize DRM and IFFs as a G20 Development Working Group topic. We're also focusing on the achievements and outcomes. I've mentioned a few of them to you, and also the next steps on how we take this forward. So the first step is really how and why we prioritized illicit financial flows as a G20 development topic. The first thing, obviously, is that illicit financial flows are a sustainable development goal. 16.4 focuses on significantly reducing illicit financial and arms flows and strengthening the recovery and return of stolen assets and combating all forms of organized crime. More importantly, it's measured through indicator 16.4.1, which measures the total value of inward and outward illicit financial flows, which are measured in United States dollars. Now, it's important to note that this definition does not include illicit financial flows and other activities that happen within the domestic economy. So we're not really measuring the activities within the domestic economy. We are measuring activities that are flowing across borders, and we're looking at the inward and the outward flows. If we look at the definition of illicit financial flows, it actually covers 4 different categories. This definition was developed in 2019 and focuses on tax and commercial practices. It looks at corruption, theft type, and terrorism activities, as well as illegal markets. What's important to note is that the definition does not include money laundering. Money laundering and terror financing are a subset of the broader ecosystem of illicit financial flows. They tend to focus on the illegal activities, but illicit financial flows also looks at the broader illicit activities. They break the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law. If you are trying to combat illicit financial flows, you need to know what the size of this is. And in order to know the size, you actually have to measure it. So UNECA, together with UNCTAD and UNODC, ran a 11-country pilot plus Egypt, focusing on 12 countries technically on the African continent. And interestingly enough, of the 11 countries, only 6 actually published their illicit financial flow numbers. And you can see that these numbers are pretty high if we look at the years from 2012 to 2020. Zambia has lost $45 billion US. South Africa has lost between 21 inward billion dollars and $40 billion in terms of outward illicit financial flows. Burkina Ghana, 8.4 billion, etc. So you can see that these numbers are pretty large. It's important to be able to intercept these. When looking at illicit financial flows, they have a number of consequences. They drain hard currency, they increase financial liquidity risk, they stimulate inflation, they reduce tax revenues and domestic resource mobilization and result in base erosion and profit shifting. They undermine trade, deplete investments. They reduce the monetary stability of the domestic economy, as well as reduce growth in the domestic economy, which then results in weak governance, weak state sovereignty, weak national security, increased financial instability, low growth, high poverty, etc. And these generally contribute to poor development outcomes at the end. So one of the reasons we focus specifically on IFFs is that a lot of countries are doing a lot in this space, and there's a lot of policies in this space with a lot of players. And what makes illicit financial flows a particularly complex problem is something we call a wicked hard problem, in that it is a cooperative governance challenge. It is a multidisciplinary problem, it is a multi-departmental problem, it is a multi-jurisdictional problem, and also requires or it incorporates the efforts of a lot of international organizations and bodies as well. And you can see here, these are just some of the players in this space. More importantly, if we look at illicit financial flows, it also has a large number of policies across different types of ecosystems, from tax to money laundering and terror financing to customs, to other policies such as the anti-corruption and procurement policies as well. And because there are so many policies working with so many different government departments, it makes this a very complex and messy space because it becomes quite incoherent and very unharmonized. And so we want to try and harmonize the policy in this ecosystem by focusing on it. If we look across the value chain, you can see the different institutions that work across it, which requires institutions to be handing the baton across to each other to address illicit financial flows. So fundamentally, it is a very fragmented value chain that works across a number of different institutions in a number of disciplines, which requires them to actually be working with each other, sharing information to try and combat illicit financial flows. And this makes it particularly complex and problematic. And finally, it stretches across the macro, meso, and micro levels. It uses a wide range of data, so it makes it a really complex space. And so this is one of the reasons why we decided to focus. Not only is it a huge developmental issue that needs to be addressed, but more importantly, it is such a complex issue to address. And so we focused on this in the G20, where we had our call to action to adopt these voluntary, non-binding, high-level principles for combating illicit financial flows and developing a roadmap. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'll show you in a little bit what it actually comprises in total. But essentially, the high-level principles focused on enhancing global financial transparency, promoting data integrity, addressing tax avoidance, evasion, and tax crimes, enhancing multilateral cooperation, implementing accountability mechanisms, promoting policy coherence, and that's focusing a lot on FATF specifically, building capacity, promoting international cooperation and collaboration, promoting international cooperation specifically around the recovery of stolen assets, looking at existing anti-IFF policy implementation, and using innovative technologies. So if we look specifically at this particular element, you can see the detail of what we're trying to do in developing the roadmap and the implementation of voluntary and non-binding principles. And you can see we look at a situational analysis, which is the first thing that needs to be developed, further by a much more comprehensive report on these different types of voluntary non-binding principles, which will actually leverage best practices that are available to G20 members, and then ultimately culminate in a roadmap. So fundamentally, if we look at these different elements, we can actually see how they link up to the F54 as well as the G20. I'm not going to really go through this slide. The combination of the G20 work and the work at the F54 in the Compromiso de Sevilla also resulted in a United Nations General Assembly resolution that focuses specifically on illicit financial flows, and this was adopted on the 15th of December. So just looking at our next steps, a draft terms of reference has been used to appoint some of the international organizations to conduct a situational analysis. We've also got to develop the high-level principles on IFFs. We haven't started that, so that's a big gap. The high-level principles, when they're unpacked with best practices, will actually allow countries to use a plug-and-play, almost like playbook, to figure out what their roadmap for implementation could look like. We need to interface into the inputs of the UK's IFF Summit in June 2026, as well as use the inputs currently from South Africa's G20 to feed into the G20 presidency of the UK in 2027. Fingers crossed that we can do that. And the most important thing, and I am about to wrap up, is to actually develop a program of action specifically for IFFs, which should be included in the Sevilla platform of action. At the moment, there are 130 initiatives specifically for the Sevilla platform for action, which was launched linked to the F54 conference, which focuses on capacity building and addressing a lot of the initiatives and improving the international financial architecture. But there isn't one that focuses specifically on IFFs, particularly for developing countries across the globe. And so if there's anything that I could ask you to think about is, how do we actually build this program of action on IFFs to be included in Sevilla? And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much. These are my email addresses. Just a short takeaway, there is an IFF course that is being developed by IDEP that is being launched. If you are interested, please do reach out to me as well. Thank you so much.
Well, that is great. Can't really thank her in the moment. We can clap though. We'll make sure to circulate. I don't know if we have the presentation currently, but we can circulate that as well as her contact details for the course. Without further ado, I think let me just hand over to you, Elizabeth, to speak to the global public goods as well as more broadly wrap up.
Great. Thank you. Hello again. What I'm going to do very briefly is just set out one of the outcomes also related to the development working group last year, which I think is also an indicator of one of the things that South Africa's G20 can be characterized as, which is really about norm entrepreneurship. Okay, whether we are sort of looking at rethinking how the cost of capital methodologies are determined, the sort of the overarching frameworks for that, or whether we are looking at developing new frameworks and new principles around illicit financial flows, whether it is some of the issues that Alex highlighted. I think there is a degree of contributing to rethinking norms. Now, we know that this is a particularly difficult time in the world to come up with new ideas and new institutions and so on. But that doesn't mean we mustn't infuse the public space and the public forum with these new ideas. And I think also Professor Ghosh's interventions around setting up an inequality panel, I think resonate with that. We know that this is not going to be easy. It's going to be a long path. We saw that also with the UN triple F's. Oh God, I've forgotten my acronyms now. FCCC. But I think that's important. One of the things then that was a priority of the South African presidency in the development working group was on global public goods. In the end, it wasn't possible to get agreement in the same way that it wasn't possible to get agreement on some of the other points that were on the agenda. We've heard that now also in the case of climate change. But there nevertheless was a chair's statement, which was actually largely negotiated by the G20 members, even though not everybody could agree with it. Now, just to remind everybody, global public goods refers to issues such as climate and environmental preservation. It's about biodiversity, global health, can include peace and security. These global public goods benefit everybody. Therefore, they are non-excludable. And by using them, you do not diminish the benefits they deliver to others. So they're also non-rivalrous. And the other important dimension of global public goods, of course, is that no single country can provide them alone. And their optimal protection and delivery depends on sustained and coordinated international cooperation. And when these are adequately managed, these global public goods, they can generate positive cross-border externalities. Now, this is not a new idea. It's been around, and UNDP was a proponent of it from the late 1990s, issued a number of reports, and the memorable Professor Inge Kaul was a lead proponent of it. But certainly to infuse it and to integrate it into our broader, let's call it development financing ecospace, I think has been really difficult. There are many initiatives that actually deal with, that try to tackle global public goods, but often, historically, many of these initiatives have taken from development cooperation, and put money into what should be a global public good. Whereas development cooperation, and I know that is now also an issue that is on its that is declining. Development cooperation is specifically to deal with issues in developing challenges in developing economies, and so it's been really difficult. The concept is still fragmented. It's clearly underfunded, and institutionally there isn't an institution that looks after it. Although there are a number of frameworks, you can argue the Paris Agreement is about global public goods. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is about that. WHO's international health regulations are also about that. Anyway, so South Africa put that on the table. I think recognizing that this was going to be not an easy issue to deal with, but also arguing that this is an important discussion to have, and you've got to start the dialogue somewhere. And what came out of the what was part of the chair's statement, and as I say, was negotiated, in fact, by most of the members, even those who were opposed to actually signing on the dotted line, were 5 key principles. The first, and that is fundamental to a discussion around global public goods, is the responsible exercise of sovereignty. Clearly, certain countries have concerns about determining that X or Y natural resource might be a global public good. Think of the lungs of the planet, and that derogates from their ability to exercise sovereignty. But we're saying it's the responsible exercise of sovereignty. It's not to undermine that. It's safeguarding and scaling international regimes. It's promoting international cooperation and regulatory frameworks that maximize the positive contribution that GPGs can make. And ensure that these are equitable and sort of provided in a just manner, and also factoring in future generations. The third one was around strengthening multilateralism. Capable and effective multilateral system is critical to tackling global challenges. In the context of the World Bank, by the way, the term they use for global public goods is global challenges. And we also have to acknowledge that strong multilateral institutions facilitate comprehensive approaches to support the improved provision of GPGs. And then two last points was around the financing the provision of GPGs and setting incentives for investment in support of GPGs. Some of the ideas there that some of you may already be familiar with relate to an initiative that has been around now for a few years, which is about global public investment, which is about fundamentally financing global public goods. But it isn't, it's about creating a different mechanism, a different pillar outside of development cooperation to do that, where everybody contributes, but they contribute according to their means, but everybody benefits, right? Non-excludable, non-rivalrous. And the other principle was harnessing innovation and technology, and we've heard enough about the importance of that in enhancing what we've discussed a lot about today, which is in fact GPGs, whether you're including investing in open science and fostering scientific, technological, industrial cooperation. Vaccines have come up as a global public good, not the vaccine itself, but the knowledge, because of the vaccine is obviously it is excludable. If I get the jab, Kessa won't, but the knowledge around it and the manufacturing around that is a global public good. So the outcome, the chair's statement talked about the establishment of an Ubuntu Commission, which would undertake a number of, not a number, but undertake research to advance a more structured approach to how we deal with global public goods, which are really, in effect, transboundary challenges, right? It would also document and share good practices. And lastly, and very importantly, and this is also something that we see the argument that was made about the inequality panel, was to encourage global dialogue and promote uptake. So it's really about creating greater sensitization and awareness. So the idea is really to sort of drive this commission over the course of the next year or so, a year and a half, 2 years, to develop this repository of good practice, because we already have good examples of global public goods, to make some policy recommendations and actionable steps, and to create perhaps a roadmap for international cooperation on the financing provision and the governance of global public goods. So stay tuned on that. But as I said, this is a really useful, I think, norm contribution to the international, the global public space. It's not about tackling the easy issues. It's really about tackling the difficult issues. So I'm going to stop there on the point about GPGs, and then just make some final remarks. And I'm really happy to take questions after that, or to take questions over lunch, in the interest of preserving our timekeeping here. I think just to reiterate a number of points that have been made. I think the first one is the importance of engaging both as an AU, as the AU, importance of engaging both with the US presidency and really thinking about the entry points that can be made with the agenda. I think we've already identified a few points in the discussion, and it's been a very rich discussion. I'd like to just thank you all for being awake, alert, and interesting. But that's the first point, important. The second point is to, at the same time, engage with the UK, the incoming UK presidency in 2027. There have already been discussions around South Africa's presidency and lessons learned, etc., with the UK. I think it is important for the AU to be discussing, and also, in fact, to be discussing with Korea. It speaks more broadly to the importance of building coalitions around the issues that are important for us. And that's a good segue into saying that the AU Commission plays a really important role, not least this year, in the G20 discussions. The G20 discussions are, in a sense, a forum where issues are debated, but can be taken forward in other forums. And we must do that, and we're already doing that, I think, in some instances, most certainly in some of the discussions around international financial architecture. But I think it is very, very important for all African countries, even when they're not chairing the AU, to maintain an interest and an engagement particularly on the finance track, I would say, which is a really important priority for the African Union, for all the reasons we've set out today. It really is important, so that the documents that we come out with in terms of an African common position are really jointly owned and co-created, and everybody is invested in them. And then lastly, to say that we also need to, take it to heart that we do have agency, and that while sometimes we may wish to respond bilaterally to circumstances, and we may be able to get short-term gain out of responding bilaterally to circumstances, I think the longer-term gain is in the long is seeing the world in the way that I now forget the Chinese premier under Mao Zedong, who was asked about what was the impact of the French Revolution in the 1950s, and he said it's too early to tell. So it's the long haul, right? We're in it for the long haul, and so coordinating even our national policies that relate and reflect some of the global issues, I think is very important. And I know it's not always easy, but I think if anything, this is the moment of a polycrisis. Again, this is we use that term often. But it is a moment of extreme crisis when I think we need to work together, because together I think we are stronger than working apart. So thank you again for your time and for your very useful contributions. Thank you also to the people online who have joined us, and thank you also to the IT team, which has had to stress out a little bit. But we've sorted it all out, and very, very big thank you to Kesa Mopipi and to Joseph Matola and to Goodwill Kachingwe colleagues at SAIA for putting this together, and then of course Arda Nepad, Professor Bart and Pamela Gopal from Arda Nepad. Thank you all, and I don't know if pictures. What pictures? We need to take a picture here. Okay, so before you go to lunch, there is lunch, right? Yes, before you go to lunch, please come to the front and we can capture the moment. Thank you all very much.